Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 35B, The Art of Reinvention, When Many Became One. A study in the masterly synthesis and systematization of bottom-up forces. In this episode, I intend to create a convergence of two different threads of previous articles. Episode 29, where I talk about the emergence of common law with its Anglo-Saxon origins, and the very last episode, which talks about the emergence of the English language, stronger, slimmer, sleeker, after being underground for more than 2 centuries, its own wilderness years which could have led it to extinction, form a sort of systems thread discussing bottom-up emergence. Episode 30B, which deals with the Roman intellectual giant, Cicero, and his cementing Latin as a supreme literary force, and Episode 34, where we met Petrarch with his paradoxes of leaning towards the Ciceronian Latin past, but unwittingly ending up setting the stage for the modern language, are a kind of literary thread. This piece, as it were, seeks to be the third part, completing 2 different trilogies, and in the process uncovering some remarkable lessons in human achievement. Let's get right into it. We have seen over the course of some of the mentioned episodes how English, in the political sphere, lost its status as an official language, but in the demographic linguistic sphere, how contact between speakers of 2 closely related languages, Old English of the Anglo-Saxons and Old Norse of the Vikings, settled and coexisting mostly peacefully, resulted in a dramatic simplification of the structure of the common speech. This latter process was accelerated, or at least left to run its course unhindered, by the former political developments of a new Norman king and nobility dominating England, apart from exerting significant influence elsewhere too in Britain, these 2 processes taking more than 4 centuries to pan out. So come the 1300s, with many of the Anglo-Norman upper classes increasingly integrated with the English by way of intermarriage and weakening of their ties to Normandy, the English language was slowly on the rise again. It was coming back over ground. There were other forces, one of which we'll come to in episode 40. But eventually, there was even a future king who was, having an English mother, raised speaking English and not Anglo-Norman French. The tide was turning. However, institutions and traditions don't change easily. English was, you could say, in most areas still at the bottom of the ladder, with Latin and then French being the prestige languages. It is in this milieu that, in the mid-1300s, we meet Geoffrey Chaucer. A new page! People have probably heard of Chaucer, at least in the English-speaking world, but I suspect he's not known well enough for his achievements. Let's meet him properly. Geoffrey Chaucer grew up in a household of wealthy wine merchants, gaining a thorough knowledge of all aspects of trade and economics consequently. He had contacts with the nobility, and later came under the patronage of the king, and thus had access to the aristocratic circles of his day. Furthermore, he worked as a civil servant, including posts of diplomatic envoy representing the Kingdom of England and a comptroller of customs for the Port of London. Besides these, he started off his early career as a page to a certain countess, and later was even involved in campaigns in the continent. This was the time when, among others, the 100 Years' War was raging between England and France. This background of his, imagine how his LinkedIn page would have looked, is relevant to our study because this wide array of stints gave him a broad range of experience which, as we shall see, he put to good use, and in unexpected ways.
The Three Crowns of Trecento.
We saw in the episode on Petrarch how the 1300s were a transitional time in Western Europe. As part of some of his assignments as envoy, Chaucer managed to get exposure to the works of, among others, the three towering figures of early Italian literature, Dante Alighieri, Giovanni Boccaccio, and Francesco Petrarch. Of these, Dante had lived and died, whilst the other two were Chaucer's contemporaries, although roughly a generation older. And as we saw in that episode, Petrarch, despite his somewhat disdain for it, had written in the vernacular, a trend set by Dante, and also emulated by Boccaccio, making them the three crowns of Italian literature. While there isn't evidence that Chaucer met Boccaccio or Petrarch in person, given his proximity to the nobility and his position as a state official, he had ample exposure and access to manuscripts and such sources, otherwise out of the reach of the ordinary scholar of the day. These experiences were formative for Chaucer, and as we shall see, for the English language itself. Chaucer, like these Italian greats, also decided to write in the vernacular, in good part inspired by them. But there were some fundamental differences, and even obstacles, Chaucer had to face, both socio-politically and linguistically, which tie in respectively to the two threads I mentioned at the beginning.
Choices, challenges.
Italian, even though also of a lower status than Latin, did not have the sense of stigma that had been attached to English for a good while, which latter aspect we've covered in detail. Furthermore, even though Chaucer, as a fellow poet, was immensely inspired by these stalwarts, it was not a simple matter of translating their works into English. It wasn't a simple Italian job. As we have seen in episode 33 and episode 33b, it was far more complex than that. In 33, we saw the development of a movement of translation and synthesis of Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian texts by the Islamic scholars into Arabic, and in the second part, we saw how this was then transferred to Latin Europe. Both these involved a large number of scholars and over decades, even centuries. Let's also remember that Arabic was the official and established language of the Caliphate in the former case, and Latin, an even more solidly established language in Western Europe, unlike what our man had in England in his time. Given all this, let's see how Chaucer pulled off a comparable feat almost single-handedly in his lifetime. Let's first look at the literal before we get to the literary. I discussed aspects of verse and meter in episode 26 and why it matters. Verse is written in a structured format, where how each phrase, each word, each syllable is arranged in the text is fundamentally of consequence to whether what you've composed is a poem or something rather more prosaic. And it's in these areas that the English of Chaucer's time, as much as today, has these fundamental differences in this context. I won't get into the full technical detail, but some skimming helps appreciate the magnitude of the challenge Chaucer faced. The Romance languages, especially French, are what's called syllable-timed, where it's the syllables that form the basis of determining meter, creating verse, writing poetry. But English, in particular after the loss of its word endings, as we saw, and the resultant emergence of a large number of monosyllabic words in sharp distinction with French and even more so Italian, is stress-timed. In other words, because some syllables are more strongly stressed and some very weakly, our pattern of verse has to take into account this fundamental nature of the language, rather than just syllable count. So simply importing French or Italian devices simply won't work If anything, it would be noticeably discordant. If this is confusing, just consider English looking at French and going, "Nah, your violin is boring. I'm going full hard rock drummer."
A state of flow.
This brings us to the iamb, the core unit of verse which is fundamental to English. An iamb consists of two syllables, where the first one is unstressed and the second one stressed. A single line of poetry in English is thus typically a collection of iambs. That most famous phrase in English is indeed iambic. To be or not to be. Chaucer's genius was to perfect a system of 5 iambs as the standard meter for poetry in English. The iambic pentameter, which I briefly mentioned in episode 26. Take these classic examples. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships? A horse, my kingdom for a horse. Minor variations in, for example, having the first foot reversed from an iamb is used for stylistics and emphasis. Furthermore, there are variations to the iambic scheme, such as the iambic tetrameter, which is what I used in my Petrarchan sonnet I shared in the previous episode. You may have noticed that 2 of the 3 examples of the iambic pentameter above come from William Shakespeare, a figure who has definitely eclipsed Chaucer in the popular imagination. But it was Chaucer's pioneering influence that later writers such as John Milton, Christopher Marlowe, Shakespeare, and countless others extensively used, the bulk of the bard's plays and sonnets being in that form.
Vox populi.
Let's now discuss the other aspect of this as promised. As mentioned, Chaucer was not only wrestling with the technical aspects such as above, but also the socio-political and practical literary questions given the state of affairs. One might say it was already unusual that he decided to write in English rather than French. He did write some bits in French early on, but they're relatively minor to his real body of works. One might buttress this point by mentioning his well-to-do upbringing and proximity and access to not only the aristocracy, but even to royalty. However, he chose to write in the speech of the common men and women, and as part of this, in a break with existing tradition, which was primarily about the chivalry of knights, the courtly love of noblemen, and such elevated matters, Chaucer chose to let common men and women tell their own tales. That's right, the Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales is set on a pilgrimage of a group of men and women from practically all walks of life, from London to Canterbury in Kent. The motley group has a knight, merchant, a clerk, a parson, a monk, a bawdy miller, a cook, and so on. Each of them tell a tale to pass the time during the journey. Within this format, Chaucer depicts a wide array of registers and dialects of the English language of the time, with wide variation in the choice of vocabulary of a teller, based on status, education, and circumstances, from lofty Latin to vain French to earthy Anglo-Saxon, thus astutely depicting and reflecting the complex, non-standard reality of the English language in his days. So what does this all mean in our own journey here? How might this matter today? Chaucer, as I hope I've demonstrated, albeit in an extremely simplistic manner, given the constraints of this medium, including my commitment to keep this non-technical and thus more widely accessible, left his mark on the English language, and therefore much else to come, in 2 fundamental areas, the 2 core threads I mentioned at the start of this piece. In line with the story of common law, Chaucer took the customary speech of the common folk. In line with Petrarch, He facilitated the formation of a national language capable of, as he'd say, matters sundry. He demonstrated, and I hope I have conveyed, that the loss of grammatical features such as word endings, gender, and other complexities, which in his time widely and even now sometimes considered decay, was actually a good thing. And thus in Chaucer, building a body of literature in the English language comparable to the existing and more respected traditions in French and Italian, English had come of age. Chaucer earned praise from some of his French contemporaries, which is telling on two counts. French, which had been the dominant language of England, and, well, the French. Even in the best of times, you say? But even more so, this was wartime. We saw last time how English almost went extinct, or at least so it seemed in its darkest hour. Imagine Chaucer hadn't elevated English to a respectable status, demonstrating its literary capabilities by shaping the form of its speech. Imagine instead Norman French remained the main or only language of literature in the land. Or imagine the choices of language form in this transitional period meant that the older, more complex, and cumbersome word forms were chosen by Chaucer in his works. In just about half a century or so, the printing press was to become reality and sweep Europe by storm, cementing the literary traditions in print, on paper, for posterity. Imagine how different the words on this page would then be. Without Chaucer, would we even have the English language as we know it? Or at all?